You tap a hurricane alert on your phone without thinking. In 1891, Galveston's chief meteorologist publicly guaranteed no serious storm could damage the city. 9 years later, 8,000 people were dead in the storm that followed, and his wife was among them. If you stood on the porch of a Galveston mansion in the summer of 1899 and looked out toward the Gulf of Mexico, you could barely see the water. The horizon sat so low against the salt grass and the sand that ships in the Gulf appeared to float on the rooftops. The illusion was real. The geography behind it was the whole problem. The island itself barely cleared the sea. Its highest point, somewhere in the middle of town, rose about 8 feet above mean tide. Everything else was lower. Everything else was waiting. The city had grown up out of this flatness almost defiantly. The Strand was the commercial heart. A line of ornate cast iron facades and plate glass ran along the wharves where cotton and grain came in from across the southwest. Counting houses sat shoulder to shoulder with steamship offices. Gas lamps came on at dusk. Beyond the warehouses, the residential streets climbed in their way toward Bishop's Palace. It was a stone and marble confection built in the late 1880s by a lawyer named Walter Gresham, who had made his money in the cotton trade and wanted the largest private residence in Texas. A few blocks east, the Moody Mansion was going up, with servants' quarters in the back and a ballroom on the second floor. Victorian rooflines, gingerbread porches, and turrets stood on pilings driven into the sand, looking for all the world like the established geography of a place that had always been there and always would be. The mansions were not for show. They housed cotton brokers and shipping agents and bankers, the people who had made fortunes moving Texas commodities through this flat and convenient port. By the standards of the 1890s, Galveston was the financial capital of the Southwest. Houston, 60 miles inland, was a secondary rail town. San Antonio was a cattle market. Dallas was growing fast, but it had no deep water. Galveston had the deep water, and the deep water had filled the city with money. By 1900, the port was handling more cotton than any other harbor in the world. Cotton came down the rivers and was loaded onto schooners bound for Liverpool and Bremen. Grain came in from the prairie and was loaded onto steamships bound for Havana. The Strand was the place where this happened, and the people who worked the wharves knew the rhythms of the bay the way farmers knew the sky. The Strand was also a showcase. Cast iron columns shipped from New Orleans held up the second floors. Wrought iron balconies jutted out over the sidewalk, painted in colors meant to suggest Marseille. At night, the gas lamps came on, and the street looked, in the postcards, like a slice of somewhere bigger. The deep water port of the Texas coast, the place that handled more tonnage than any other harbor between New Orleans and Veracruz. In the morning, the merchants opened their ledgers, the longshoremen went down to the wharves, and the cotton brokers closed deals in upper floor offices with the windows thrown open to the Gulf breeze. The residents who lived above the Strand and along the avenues to the west had built their daily lives on top of this geography. And the geography, in turn, shaped them in small, often invisible ways. There was no fresh water on the island. Every drop came in by barge or by pipe from the mainland. People filled cisterns. Children learned not to waste the bath. In summer, the salt marsh at the bay side of the island gave off a smell that the locals had stopped noticing decades ago. The mosquitoes were something else. They came up off the marsh in clouds at dusk, and the smarter residents had learned to be inside before sunset. None of this was a hardship in the way an absence of food or work would have been. It was just the cost of living on a flat sandbar that the sea had been kind enough, so far, not to reclaim. Tourists came from Houston just to walk the Seawall and the boulevard. They rented bathing suits and went into the surf. They sailed out into the Gulf for sport fishing and came back to grand hotels where the dining room served oysters on the half shell and the windows rattled gently when the wind picked up. They were visiting the New York of the Gulf. They were visiting and going home again. The Galvestonians had made their peace with the water in a particular way. Every few years, when the winds and the tides lined up just right, the Gulf pushed a shallow sheet of seawater up through the storm drains and into the lower streets. The locals called these overflows. Some of them reached the second step of the front porches. A few of them got into the ground floors of warehouses down on the wharf. The residents did not evacuate. They pulled on rubber boots, posed for cameras, and walked down to the strand to watch the water come in. It was a curiosity. It was the price of living on a sandbar. Mothers carried small children down to the flooded intersections so they could see the reflections of the gas lamps in the water. The water came in. The water went out. Life resumed. The closest the city had come to thinking otherwise was 13 years before. In 1886, a hurricane had all but erased the smaller port town of Indianola, 200 miles down the coast. Galvestonians sent relief supplies and read about the wreckage with the comfortable detachment of people for whom the wreckage had happened somewhere else. That was Indianola. Indianola was down the coast. Indianola had been built on the open prairie, with no island to protect it. Galveston had its own geography, its own pilings, its own prosperity. That was the whole of the calculation, and most people never revised it. The geography the calculation ignored was this. The island was roughly 30 miles long, and, in places, barely a mile and a half wide. To leave, you crossed to the mainland on a single railroad causeway. This was a narrow strip of fill, raised only a few feet above the marsh that ran across Galveston Bay. There was no second road. There was no high bridge. There was no overpass. If the water rose, the causeway went with it. For most of the year, the causeway was simply the way out. Trains ran twice a day. Wagons crossed at low tide. In a hard rain, it flooded, and residents postponed their trip. A flooded causeway was an inconvenience. It was not in anyone's mind a death sentence. There was no uptown, no hill on the horizon, no basement shelter with concrete walls. There was the beach and the city built behind it, and the bay and the marsh, and the rest of Texas somewhere beyond. The condition was not the storm. The condition was the geography everyone had decided to ignore. Some Galvestonians had tried, in modest ways, to push back. Decades before, residents had planted salt cedars along the dunes on the Gulf side, hoping the roots would hold the sand in place. By the 1890s, the salt cedars had grown tall. From a distance, they looked like a hedge along the dune line, brown-green in summer and gray in winter. Children played among them. Lovers walked there in the evening. They were not, to most residents, a piece of engineering. They were scenery. Builders had begun putting ground floors up on higher blocks, raising the parlor a few feet above the sidewalk, on the assumption that whatever the Gulf might do, it would do what it had always done. None of this was designed for a major hurricane. It was sized for ordinary high water. That was the kind the city had already survived, the kind that came in and went out, and left everyone with a story to tell. What the residents had decided was, in the end, a way of seeing. They had looked at their mansions, their counting houses, their schools and churches, their hospitals and orphanages, and concluded that the city would go on. They had looked at the Gulf and concluded it would stay politely out beyond the horizon. They were not wrong about the mansions, or the counting houses, or the schools. They were wrong about the Gulf, and the Gulf had been waiting. The man who said it was impossible was Isaac Cline. He had been the chief local meteorologist of the United States Weather Bureau in Galveston since 1889. He was not a hack. He was trained, careful, and respected. The Weather Bureau itself was new, only 30 years old, transferred out of the Army Signal Corps into the Department of Agriculture in 1891, just 9 years before the storm. The science of hurricane forecasting was younger still. 8,000 people on that island would be dead before the decade was out. Cline had written a piece for the Galveston Daily News in 1891, laying out what he and the rest of the Bureau believed at the time. A serious hurricane, one strong enough to push a damaging surge of water across the island, was, in his words, a crazy idea. It was an absurd delusion. It was, he wrote, impossible for any cyclone to create a storm wave that would materially injure the city. He wrote it clearly. He wrote it confidently. He wrote it on the Bureau's behalf, and the Bureau had not changed its view in the 9 years since. The 1891 article had run in the Daily News as a kind of authoritative reassurance. Cline had been at his desk in the Federal Building when he wrote it. The Bureau's barometers had been in the same room. He had looked at the records of every storm that had crossed the Gulf in the previous decade, and the records had shown him what the Bureau believed, that the storms had weakened before reaching the Texas coast, or turned north, or stayed offshore. None of them had driven a serious surge into Galveston. None of them had been a serious hurricane by the time they reached Galveston. Cline had taken this pattern and turned it into a guarantee. The guarantee had not been written as a guarantee. It had been written as analysis, but analysis, printed in the newspaper under the Bureau's name, read as guarantee. The merchants, the bankers, the city fathers had filed it away as the official view. The Seawall petitions that came up for federal funding in the years after 1891 were sent back to Washington with the article attached, and the article was the reason they came back unfunded. The Bureau's confidence was not Cline's alone. The Army Corps of Engineers had looked at the question of a seawall for the island and concluded, in the 1880s and again in the 1890s, that one was not warranted. The Texas legislature had considered the matter and declined to fund it. The city fathers of Galveston, who could have taxed themselves to build one, had better uses for the money. Everyone who had been asked had agreed. The science of the day said it could not happen. The engineers said a wall was not needed. The legislators said they would not pay for one. Cline had been the one to write it down for the newspapers. He had not been the only one to believe it. To understand what the science of the day could actually see, you have to subtract almost everything you now take for granted. There were no satellites. There was no radar. There were no reconnaissance aircraft. There were no ocean buoys measuring wind and pressure in real time. There was the telegraph, and that was almost all. A hurricane in 1900 became known to the Bureau only when it crossed a coastline and began wrecking the cities there. By the time the Bureau knew a storm existed in the Gulf, it was already too late to warn anyone it might hit next. By the time the telegraph from Washington reached Galveston on Friday morning, the storm the Bureau was warning about had already done its worst work. It had crossed the coast at Louisiana the night before. It had knocked down wires in 3 parishes. The reports that came into the Washington office were fragmentary. A sheriff in one town, a portmaster in another, a hotel keeper in a third, each describing a piece of the damage. The reports did not include a position. The reports did not include a wind speed. The reports did not include a trajectory. They included wreckage. They included the word cyclone, and from wreckage and a single word, the Bureau was expected to figure out where the storm was going. Cline spent the rest of Friday and the early hours of Saturday watching the barometer fall. The wind shifted. The tide behaved strangely. He did not have a satellite image to show him where the storm was. He had the barometer at his office, and the falling barometer, and the wires from the cities already hit. By Saturday morning, he understood that the storm was not where the Bureau thought it was on Friday. The storm was not where the wires had said it was. The storm was much closer to Galveston than anyone had realized. The flag had already been raised, but a flag in 1900 was not an evacuation order. There was no system of evacuation. There was no plan. There was no one to call. There was only the expectation that if the wind got bad, people would go inside, and if the water got bad, people would go up. The Bureau had not been built to tell a city when to leave. The Bureau had been built to tell a city when to tie down the loose boards. The error was not Cline's. The error was institutional. The error was a science that was 30 years old, a Bureau that had been transferred out of the Army only 9 years before. a set of tools that could only see the storm after the storm had already hit someone else. Cline had written the confident article in 1891 because the science of 1891 could not see a hurricane in time to be useful. He had believed his own article for 9 years. He would stop believing it on Saturday morning. Saturday morning, September 8th, 1900. The sky over Galveston was the color of the inside of an oyster shell. People came down to the Strand in their light clothes. The town was a town, and the town was working. The mule-drawn ice wagons came down the residential streets. The bakery on Tremont Street opened its doors at 6, and the smell of bread reached the corner of Avenue H by 6:15. Men in dark suits walked to the Federal Building. The cotton brokers were at their desks by 8. The clerks were copying the wire reports into ledgers. The lawyers were dictating letters. They read the Galveston Daily News. On page 3, below the shipping news and the cotton prices, there was a small headline, "Storm in the Gulf." The subhead read, "Great damage reported on Mississippi and Louisiana coasts. Wires down, details meager." Most readers turned the page. There was nothing to do about a storm in the Gulf. The flag was up at the Levee Building. The flag had been up since Friday. People had seen the flag. Isaac Cline walked the 4 blocks from his rented rooms to the Federal Building that morning and noticed 3 things at once. The tide was higher than it should have been. The wind was coming from the north. And the barometer in his office was falling in a way he had not seen in his 11 years on the job. Cline was not a man given to public alarm. But on Saturday morning, he made a decision that went against every rule the Weather Bureau had written. He went outside. He found a horse and cart, and he drove into the low-lying neighborhoods along the bay, shouting at the residents to leave their houses. The streets were already flooding. Cline's cart cut through water that reached the horse's belly. He shouted at families to take their children and go to higher ground. He shouted at the dock workers along the wharf to leave. He shouted at the women hanging laundry in their backyards. He shouted at the elderly couple in the frame house on the corner. Most of them did not know who he was. Some of them had seen the 1891 article, and they thought he had come to tell them the storm was going to turn north. He had come to tell them the opposite. He had come to tell them the storm was already on top of them. By 9 o'clock on Saturday morning, the wind was already picking up. By 10, the rain was steady. By 11, the Strand was beginning to flood at the lower intersections. The cotton brokers noticed the water on the floor of the counting houses and sent the clerks down to put down sandbags. The lawyers on the upper floors of their buildings could see, from the windows, that the bay was rising, but the tide had risen before. The tide had always gone back out. The brokers went back to their ledgers. The lawyers went back to their dictation. The Sunday picnics had been planned. The Monday trains were scheduled to run. There was no reason to think the week would not resume. By early afternoon, the wind had picked up to a howl. The rain gauge at Cline's office blew away. The anemometer stopped working around 4:30. By then, the sky had turned the color of iron, and the bay water was climbing the streets faster than the storm drains could carry it. The flag at the Levee Building was a rag. The Strand, where the morning before the cotton brokers had been closing deals in their shirt sleeves, was a brown river running between the cast iron facades. Cline went home to his family around 5 in the afternoon. He had built the house himself 2 years before, with the deliberate intention of beating the worst storm the island had ever seen. The first floor was raised above the high water mark of the 1875 overflow. The walls were anchored. The pilings went down 16 feet. He had shown the plans to anyone who would look at them. He had been proud of the house. He had been certain of the house. By 7 that evening, the house had water around the pilings. By 8, the water was on the first floor. Cline brought his pregnant wife Cora and his 3 daughters. Allie Mae was 12, Rosemary was 11, Esther was 6, into the upper story, along with the neighbors who had come in from the lower blocks. There were about 50 people in the house by then. They had candles, they had water, they had each other. At some point in the next 2 hours, the surge came through. Cline's brother Joseph, who had ridden out from the office to help, was holding one of the girls when a wave came through a window. The pressure dropped. The wall gave. The water came in chest high and rose. A chest of drawers was lifted off the floor and pinned Cline underwater. He got free. The water was black. The water was full of timber and brick, and the things that had been the inside of his neighbors' houses. Joseph broke through a window with his shoulder and grabbed the 3 girls one by one and pulled them out of the house. Cora was pregnant with their 4th child. Cora did not come out. Her body was found 25 days later, under the wreckage on which her own family had drifted to safety. The surge at the Cline house was happening, in its way, on every block. Across the residential neighborhoods west of the Strand, the bay water was already a foot above the sidewalks by 6 in the evening. By 9, it was chest high in the parlor floors of the houses on Avenue H. By midnight, it was on the 2nd stories. People who had climbed onto their roofs were pulled off. People who had climbed into their attics were pulled out through the rafters. The clapboard from the residential blocks was mixed in with the brick from the commercial buildings on the wharf, all of it rolling through the streets like a river carrying lumber. The telegraph had gone down by 9. The fire alarm had stopped. Down on the wharf, the cast iron facades that had held up the Strand in the photographs were giving way one column at a time, and the cotton bales that had been stacked in the warehouses were loose in the bay, some of them still bound in the iron ties of the loading cranes. By midnight, the center of the storm had passed the island. The wind dropped. The rain stopped. The water began to fall. Sunday morning came up on a city that did not know what it was. Survivors climbed out of attics, out of trees, and out of the wreckage piles where the lower blocks had been. They stood in knee-deep water and looked down streets they did not recognize. Houses were turned around. Houses were stacked on top of houses. Some that had been a block from the wharf were sitting on the wharf itself. The Bishop's Palace, Walter Gresham's stone and marble residence on Broadway, was still standing. Its roof had been stripped of slate. The Moody Mansion, a few blocks east, had taken on water to the 2nd story. Both houses had been built near the highest ground on the island. They were now islands in their own right. The high water mark, when it was measured the next week, ran at 15 feet and 7 inches above mean low tide. The highest point on the island before the storm had been 8 feet and 7 inches. The line that the water had drawn across the city was a line above the rooftops of every building that had been standing the day before. The bodies came with the falling water. They lay in the streets. They hung from the iron balconies of the ruined hotels. They lay against the brick walls of the lower Strand, like cargo that had been dropped. A recovery committee was formed within hours, but the ground was too saturated to dig. They tried to take the bodies out to sea on barges and sink them. The tides brought them back. They tried to bury them in trenches. The trenches filled with groundwater. So they built pyres from the wreckage of the houses. The first were lit on Sunday afternoon. They burned in relays for 6 weeks. The smoke was visible from the mainland. Workers were given whiskey to keep them at the work. Many bodies were never identified. Hundreds were never found. The unmarked mass graves remain beneath the streets of the modern city. At St. Mary's Orphanage on Church Street, 3 of the sisters had tied themselves to the children with clothesline. They had tied long cords from waist to waist, child to sister, child to child, so that no child could be swept away alone. The water climbed past the 2nd story windows. The roof lifted. The walls gave. Of the 93 children inside, 90 died. All 10 of the sisters died with them. 3 boys had survived. They had floated in some way the record does not fully explain, in the flood that by Sunday morning was 3 feet deep on the western prairie. They were found the next day, clinging to the top branches of a pecan tree, 1.5 miles from where the orphanage had been. They were 6, 7, and 8 years old. They were all that was left of the orphanage. Some of the sisters were later found with children still tied to them. The seawall that the residents had petitioned for and the Army Corps had declared unnecessary and the legislature had refused to fund, was begun in 1902 and finished in its first 3-mile stretch in the summer of 1904. It was 17 feet tall above mean low tide, poured concrete reinforced with steel rods, anchored by granite blocks brought in by rail from New England. The same Army Corps that had pronounced it unnecessary in 1891 supervised the construction. The wall alone was not enough. Behind it, the city still lay flat. A flat city on a sandbar with one causeway could not survive another storm of the same scale. So the city fathers, with money raised by a special tax district and with labor brought in from across the South, began to raise the city itself. They pumped mud from the bottom of the harbor up through iron pipes and laid it, in sections, beneath the foundations of the houses. They jacked the houses up on timbers, laid the mud underneath, and lowered them back down. Some houses were raised by 8 feet, some by 17. The street grades were raised with them. The sidewalks were raised. The church floors were raised. By 1910, much of the city sat, on average, between 10 and 17 feet higher than the city that had drowned in 1900. The Bishop's Palace, which had stood near the highest ground on the island in 1900, was now standing on a block that sat 17 feet higher than its original elevation. Walter Gresham's stone and marble walls had survived the storm. They would survive whatever came next. The Moody Mansion was raised with the rest of its block. So were the cast iron facades along the Strand, lifted off their original foundations and placed on top of the new fill. What survived of the city had been deliberately pushed out of the reach of the next storm. The test came in August 1915. A hurricane of nearly the same intensity struck Galveston directly. The water rose, the wall held. Inside the protected side, 8 people died. 8 in a city that had lost 8,000 the first time. Outside the wall, where the grade raising had not yet been completed, 90% of the buildings were demolished. The forecasting apparatus that had been blind in 1900 took longer to put right. The Weather Bureau moved its Hurricane Forecast Center from Havana to Washington in 1902, and a Hurricane Warning Office was opened in New Orleans to address Gulf warnings directly. Marine radio, which allowed ships at sea to report storms in real time, became operational in 1905. Aircraft, radar, and satellites arrived over the following decades. Each of those instruments was an answer to a question the 1900 storm had asked first. The road you would take if a storm came for the island today is one of them. Interstate 45, the only highway off the barrier, is part of a dedicated hurricane evacuation corridor maintained by the state of Texas. The contraflow plan, in which all lanes of the highway are turned outbound during a threat, is rehearsed every spring. When the alert reaches your phone, the path it lights up ends at Galveston. This is the chain. The funeral pyres of 1900 led to a seawall that took 2 years to build. The seawall led to the largest deliberate lifting of a city in American history. The lifting led to a wall that, 15 years later, held against a storm of nearly the same intensity. The wall held, and the Bureau moved its forecast office to Washington, and marine radio came in, and the hurricane hunters started flying, and the satellites went up, and the radar dishes went up on the coast, and the regional forecast offices were chartered, and the evacuation corridors were marked out, and the algorithm that wakes your phone at 2 in the morning was written. Each link was an answer to a question someone had asked inside a burning house in 1900, or inside a tree 1.5 miles from where an orphanage had been. Each link was paid for by the people who lived and the people who did not. You do not think about a hurricane alert any more than you think about the water coming out of a tap. In September 1900, on an island lower than the storm surge that hit it, no one was going to send the alert. The science that would send it had not yet been built. The man whose job it had been to build it had written in the local paper that the storm itself could not happen. He was wrong in the way an entire institution can be wrong, and the city believed him in the way a city believes an institution. When the storm finally came, he drove his horse into the flood to take it back. He lost his wife. He lost the children in the orphanage. He lost one house in 5. He did not lose the lesson. If you grew up on the Gulf or anywhere in hurricane country, what is the storm that lives in your family's memory? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone. Subscribe to the Origin Portal for a new origin story every day.